Intro, yeah.
I shouldn't say anything more about
I had all but two people in my class that posted their pieces, but who actually showed up to class today at least. So I thought that was pretty good. She was better than
All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Alyssa Karpinka, and I'm filling in for McNally Robinson's event coordinator tonight. This event is coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. Just to note that this event is being live streamed, so please be aware of the webcam to your right. I'll also take this moment to encourage you to silence your phones for the duration of the event. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch of Canada in Afghanistan by Owen Schalk, published by James Lorimer and Company. Thank you to Owen for being here tonight and to Ethan Klein for joining us as host. Ethan is a settler MFA in writing candidate at the University of Saskatchewan, focusing on short stories and creative nonfiction. Ethan grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and currently lives in Saskatoon with his wife, 2 dogs, and 2 cats. Owen Schalk is an independent researcher and writer whose work focuses on domestic and foreign policy. He is a columnist at Canadian Dimension magazine. I'll now turn things over to Owen. Please give him a warm welcome.
Hello, everybody. Thanks everybody for coming out tonight and for your interest in my book, Canada in Afghanistan. Can you hear me okay, everybody? So I want to start my remarks by talking about a book that was not written by me, but which is very relevant to the arguments that I make in my work. And that book is called The Canadian Army in Afghanistan, and it was written by Sean Maloney, who's a historian at the Royal Military College in Kingston. And it was released in short supply a few months ago. And unlike my history, this one was commissioned by the Canadian Army and the Department of National Defense during the years of the war. And Maloney was embedded with Canadian troops for months at a time in Kandahar and Kabul, talking to people and researching this history. But Maloney came to some less than flattering conclusions about the mission, which did not please his sponsors. When he wrote critically about the Canadian government's conduct, DND tried to censor his work. And I'm going to quote a CBC article from November of last year on this topic. Publication of Maloney's book was held up for almost a decade by reviews and debates within DND and the Canadian forces about Maloney's often blunt assessments, namely his criticism of Canada's allies and other government departments, and his questioning of some decisions by senior commanders. Maloney said he started experiencing pushback within DND and the military after he turned in his first draft. CBC News asked for an interview with the commander of the Army for an explanation of the concerns, but the request was denied. Maloney himself is quoted as saying, "There are a number of people that tried to step in and interfere with my editorial prerogative, including a colonel who stepped in to say that I can't contradict an established Canadian position for political reasons." Maloney also found that portions of his text were rewritten without his permission. In other words, the military was actively trying to dictate the content of a history it had commissioned ostensibly in order to educate the Canadian people. Maloney's history is now available in electronic form, but there are no plans to support the public sale of physical copies. And as the CBC notes, quote, "The limited distribution and the delays in publication are a source of frustration for veterans who served in the war. Dozens of them have reached out to CBC since the summer to complain." Steve Lukitz, another professor at the RMC, wrote in the Ottawa Citizen that special interests in the Army repeatedly interfered with and delayed publication because they did not like what Maloney's history revealed. And historian Murray Brewster put it bluntly when he said, quote, "They were attempting to suppress the history." I wanted to start with the controversy around Maloney's book because it introduces an important topic and one that relates to the argument that I make in my book. That argument being the Department of National Defense likes to control the narrative around what Canadian forces do throughout the world and why they do it. And DND puts a lot of money and resources into asserting that control. This is not unique to Afghanistan. In one chapter in my book, I lay out a concise history of Canadian military censorship going all the way back to Canada's first overseas war, the Boer War of 1899 to 1902. This censorship involves straight up spiking stories that make Canadians look bad. It involves restricting the topics that journalists can cover. And it involves a more recent innovation, paying for celebrities to visit Canadian bases and publicly endorse the war effort. And that was a major part of the Afghanistan mission, and especially the strategy of then Defense Chief Rick Hillier. So I've said that DND wanted to control the narrative during the Afghanistan mission, but what was that narrative? What did it emphasize? Whose point of view did it privilege, and what did it omit? I'm sure everyone here will have some idea about the narrative that was constructed around the war by military leadership, by successive Canadian governments, and by the media. That narrative being one of a benevolent Canadian effort to bring democracy, education, women's rights, and security to these supposedly benighted or backward Afghan people. It's a narrative that the Canadian state put substantial resources into crafting as it aimed to sell the war to the public. But what my book aims to do is explain why that narrative is lacking, where it's lacking, and the political reasons why it was constructed in the first place, specifically what it's meant to obscure. And I think the specific narrative cultivated around Afghanistan draws from what Canadian historian Jock Powell calls mythologized history. In the Canadian context, mythologized history argues that Canada's actions on the global stage are driven by values rather than material interests. And that's a view that I totally reject as an analyst of this country's foreign policy. And importantly, calling into question that values-based or idealistic narrative around Afghanistan simultaneously calls into question the mythologized history of Canadian foreign policy as a whole, something the state most certainly does not want. Challenging that mythologized history is a goal of my book, which is why in order to tell the story of the Canadian mission in Afghanistan, I go all the way back to 1945, to Canada adopting a more assertive global role after World War II, and the strategies of Canadian power projection in this new era, be it quote-unquote peacekeeping, quote-unquote foreign aid, be it military support for Western empires, be it the strategic undermining of democracy around the world, including by backing military coups in countries that undermine so-called Canadian or Western interests. These are all tactics that surfaced again during the Afghanistan mission in various forms. Scott Taylor, a Canadian infantryman and editor of the Esprit de Corps military magazine, describes the Afghanistan mission as, quote, a deception foisted on the Canadian public. Military journalist David Pugliese has said that during the Afghanistan war, Canadians were subjected to the most wide-ranging propaganda campaign since World War II. The fact is, there's so much still missing from national conversations about Canada's role in this war, and that includes the way that the Canadian public and soldiers themselves were misled about the motives behind the mission. As such, this book is an attempt to reclaim history that was marginalized during the years of occupation and ever since, relevant history of both Canada and Afghanistan. And in order to reclaim and to foreground this history, I researched the relevant topics over a period of about 2 years, studying the writings of armed forces members from the lower ranks up to the defense chief, of Canadian diplomats, ambassadors, development officials, ministers, prime ministers, of US officials, because the American empire looms so large in Canadian decision-making, and of Afghans themselves, both inside and outside the post-Taliban government. These individuals, these personalities are woven through my book, but my book is not personality driven. It's about the social, economic, and political forces that shape Canadian foreign policy. So for background, I want to briefly run through the military mission itself. And in the book, I divide the mission into 4 sections, each one represented by a major Canadian operation in Afghanistan. First, Operation Apollo from 2001 to 2003, and the first phase of Operation Athena from 03 to 05, the second phase of Athena from 05 to 2011, and then finally Operation Attention from 2011 to 2014. All these operations were undertaken in a geopolitical context that saw Canada working with the US and NATO in Washington's pursuit of a certain regional and global order. In the book, I lay out what I believe that order to be, one in which the energy resources of Central and South Asia were integrated under US auspices, the resource wealth of the region was open to Western investment, and other regional and global powers, including Iran, Russia, and China, were rendered subordinate or sidelined in that process. So going back 2001, after the 9/11 attack, the US launched Operation Enduring Freedom, its mission to invade Afghanistan and overthrow the Taliban, which was viewed as an ally of Al-Qaeda. At the time, Canada contributed to Enduring Freedom through an operation called Apollo, which involved 7,000 troops working hand in glove with US forces. Apollo involved almost every part of the Department of National Defense, or D&D, including ground forces, Navy, air, and special forces, namely the notorious Joint Task Force 2. When Apollo drew to a close in 2003, Canada moved into the first phase of Operation Athena. This phase was based in Kabul in comparison to the second phase, which moved to Kandahar. This first phase was meant to support the goals of the International Security Assistance Force, or the ISAF, which was this multinational coalition established in Bonn, Germany in 2001, in a meeting of numerous global powers as well as Afghan anti-Taliban forces. Now, through Athena, Canada provided security for the new Afghan authorities as they organized elections for president and parliament. CEDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, which has now been renamed Global Affairs Canada, also opened offices there. The Canadian ambassador was welcomed back, and Canadian money started pouring into the country. In this context, the new Afghan government and its backers got to work on a constitution, on elections, on forming new security forces, and on really building an entirely new state apparatus. And it should be emphasized during this period that those who were empowered in this process were not the progressive forces of change in Afghanistan, those fighting for gender equality or economic equality. The factions which were empowered during this period of state building were warlords and militias associated with the Northern Alliance, a military alliance consisting of Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras mainly, groups that had plenty of reason to dislike the Pashtun Taliban organization. But in terms of social views and religious views, they shared many similarities with the Taliban. So Athena Phase 1 was also when Canada became deeply involved in the new Afghan state's economic policy. Through a team of 15 officers known as the SATA, or Strategic Advisory Team Afghanistan, Canadian forces exercised influence over the new Afghan government out of all proportion to their actual size. And of course, Canada had its own material interests for crafting a new economic policy for Afghanistan. And we can see that in the policy that the SATA helped produce. The Afghan National Development Strategy, or the ANDS, which laid out the new economic orientation of the Afghan government, was drafted with Canadian advisors. And it laid out that privatization and foreign investment would be central to the new Afghanistan. And what followed the implementation of this policy? Well, the role of the state in Afghanistan diminished immensely, and Afghanistan's resources were put up for sale to foreign companies, including Canadian companies. And I want to just offer a brief and incomplete list of Canadian companies that benefited from the policy that Canadian planners helped craft from within the Afghan halls of power. Lockheed Martin Canada, Canaccord Financial, SRK Consulting, SNC-Lavalin, and Kilo Gold Mines, which bought part of the Hajigak mine, which has been called the largest untapped iron deposit in Asia. So after the new president, Hamid Karzai's power was entrenched in Kabul and his Canadian-approved policies were implemented, the second phase of Operation Athena began. This saw Canadian forces move from Kabul to Kandahar, where they took over the Provincial Reconstruction Team, or PRT, from US forces. Canada specifically volunteered to take Kandahar because it was one of the most volatile provinces in the south, and Ottawa viewed this as a way to increase Canada's prestige within the NATO alliance. But there was another important factor, and that was Iraq. As Chris Alexander, Canada's leading diplomat in Afghanistan, stated, the US government was very happy to see Canadians take over Kandahar because it allowed those American troops to transfer to Iraq to help the occupation there. So we often hear that Canada stood firm against the Iraq invasion, but we did support it in a lot of less direct ways like that. It was under Athena Phase 2 that we saw major operations like Mountain Thrust and Medusa. And it was in Kandahar that Canada began to expand its development programs to things like schools, health and education projects, the Dakhla Dam, and a polio eradication campaign. These initiatives were much advertised, but they too were not successful. But they did serve the important function of obscuring the fact that Canada was deeply involved in a counterinsurgency war, and not, as the mission was often consciously branded, a humanitarian peacekeeping mission. There's a lot that can be said about this phase of the mission, and I detail it in my book. There's the psychological operations that were conducted on the Afghan people, examples of journalists being prevented from covering certain topics or being pressured to cover other topics, the attacks on civilians in the province that generated a lot of anger against the occupation, and even contributed to anti-Canadian marches in Kandahar, where people were holding "Death to Canada" signs. And there was also the gradual shift in Canadian public opinion during this time, turning against the mission, slowly but surely. Now, when US troops returned to Kandahar in 2011, the Canadians withdrew to Kabul and began the Operation Attention training mission. During this time, Chris Alexander claimed the Canadians were the second most important training force for the Afghan National Army, only after the Americans. But over the course of the next few years, Canada gradually withdrew its forces so that by 2014, the military mission was effectively closed. So that's a broad overview and a brief overview, but it admittedly doesn't get at the question of why Canadian forces failed in the mission. And I want to read a brief section from the book that will maybe shine some light on that. After a sip of water. Through each of the 4 phases of Canadian military engagement, incidents cropped up that severely limited the Canadian forces' ability to generate goodwill among the Afghan populace. These incidents received little coverage in Canadian media and were rarely discussed by government officials. The process by which Canada helped overthrow the Taliban and impose a new state was ostensibly democratic, but as already noted, it was tipped in favor of US allies such as Hamid Karzai and the Northern Alliance warlords. These candidates received enormous funding packages from the US government and benefited from some Afghans voting for them multiple times, a practice that Karzai himself encouraged. Canada welcomed the results of these elections and funded another presidential election in 2009, which was once again dominated by warlords, drug traffickers, and documented cases of fraud. Once more, US ally Karzai won the election handily. During the entire 12-year deployment, Canadian officials extolled the democratic conduct and values of their troops, while ignoring the deluge of polls that suggested Afghans would be happier without a foreign occupation. Indeed, most Afghans supported a negotiated end to the war rather than a prolonged counterinsurgency. In October 2007, an ABC News poll found that 57% of people in Afghanistan had a negative opinion of the US role there, and 55% of those surveyed in Kandahar disapproved of the NATO presence. A poll released that same month found that only 48% of respondents in Kandahar supported the direction their country was headed. Furthermore, of those who interacted directly with Canadian troops, less than half said the experience was positive. People who claimed a negative opinion of the Canadian presence listed the killing of innocent people and the searching of houses without permission as the 2 main reasons for their views. Some polls indicate that negative views of the occupation grew with time. For example, surveys conducted by NATO forces in 2010 found that upwards of 70% of people in Helmand and Kandahar opposed the coalition's military actions. Committees convened to analyze Canada's role in Afghanistan came to similar conclusions. In 2006, an international think tank called the Senless Council found that Canada's, quote, predominantly military intervention has resulted in significant civilian deaths and local discontent, and that the Afghan population generally does not distinguish between Canadian and American soldiers. In 2007, the Standing Senate Committee on National Security and Defense released a report criticizing the brutal actions of Canada's allies in Kabul. The report quotes an Afghan police colonel who claimed that Canada had no chance of winning the support of the people of Kandahar as long as so many innocent Afghans were dying in NATO airstrikes. Likewise, the Canadian practice of turning over prisoners of war for gruesome torture by Afghan authorities did not endear the occupiers to locals. Nor did the fact that Canada's allies in the Afghan army were primarily Tajik or Uzbek, not Pashtun like most people in Kandahar, meaning that even national Afghan authorities were often viewed as foreign occupiers in the province. In addition to inflicting widespread violence on populations it claimed to be protecting, Canada failed to meet its development goals in Afghanistan generally and Kandahar specifically. The Standing Committee's 2007 report criticized CETA for focusing on building up the central state at the expense of people in Kandahar, while a 2015 report by Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development Canada found that, quote, in Kandahar, there is little evidence of positive long-term outcomes of capacity building activities. Despite these revelations, the Canadian government extended the military's withdrawal deadline several times, and continued to claim that counterinsurgency was the best way forward. In January 2008, the independent panel on Canada's future role in Afghanistan, nicknamed the Manley Report after its chairman, released its parliamentary report, which called for the deployment of more NATO forces to Kandahar and more advanced military equipment to Canadian soldiers. In essence, the Manley Report argued that Canada's only option was to continue supporting US goals in Afghanistan and the wider region by strengthening the Canadian military's ability to fight a long-term counterinsurgency war. By the time Canada finally withdrew its combat troops in 2011, the government had spent $18.5 billion in Afghanistan, and spending continued even after the withdrawal. Operation Attention ran up a bill of $500 million, while Ottawa continued to fund the Afghan army for years after 2014. What did Canada have to show for its 12-year participation in the military occupation of Afghanistan? In retrospect, it seems the mission produced little more than an abandoned dam in Kandahar, a constellation of rarely used schools, countless dead Afghan fighters and civilians, 165 dead Canadians, more than 2,000 wounded, and a widely distrusted state apparatus based out of Kabul that dissolved like a sandcastle when US forces withdrew in August 2021. Canada's defeat in Afghanistan did not stem from the Afghan people's failure to learn. Canadian forces fell short of all their major objectives because of the warlords they empowered, the popular demands they ignored in favor of Washington's regional aims, the innocent people they helped torture and kill, and the logic of occupation and counterinsurgency they never abandoned. When understood this way, Canada's defeat in Afghanistan and the Taliban's victory in the summer of 2021 come as no surprise. So lastly, I want to explain a little bit about why I wrote this book and what I hope it will achieve. By way of background, Canada and Afghanistan began as a series of articles in late summer and early fall of 2021. That was the summer that we saw the Taliban's final offensive, the taking of Kabul, and a defeat for the US occupation that could not have been more decisive. After August 15th, the day Kabul fell to the Taliban, I was following US media closely. And I noticed there were some genuinely critical articles coming out of the US that examined the root causes for America's defeat. I'm thinking of a New York Times article that analyzed how funds for Afghanistan were applied. And this article found that of the $2 trillion that the US Congress approved for Afghanistan, only $24 billion went toward developing the Afghan economy. That's only about 2% of the total. And of course, a few years previous, we saw the Afghanistan papers, which revealed that high-ranking officials in Washington knew the war was unwinnable, but continued to mislead the public about the possibility of victory. So there was some critical coverage of the occupation coming out in the US, but in comparison, there was next to nothing in Canada. No efforts to tally Canadian failures or to see how the money was delivered or to even investigate the reasons why Canada went there in the first place. And it's true that Canadian combat forces had withdrawn from the country years before the US, but in my opinion, the spectacle of Kabul falling so decisively should have provoked some kind of retrospection in Canada, and it did not. There hasn't been an Afghanistan papers for Canada. In the media and the government, there doesn't seem to be any curiosity toward Canada's role in Afghanistan and how it may have contributed to the eventual defeat of occupation forces. And just as a note on the Canadian media, they played a huge role in misleading the public about this war. And in the book, I cite research by Brooks DeCilia, a professor at Mount Royal University, who analyzed Canadian media coverage of the war in depth, and specifically which people Canadian media chose to platform and to quote and which it did not. And DeCilia found that during the war, military and government officials made up almost half of all primary sources in Canadian newspapers. 45% of media reports did not include a secondary source, but when they did, military and government officials were again the most likely to be cited. Canada's media was 11 times more likely to quote a Canadian official than an Afghan official or civilian, and anti-war voices were completely marginalized, accounting for 0.3% of primary sources in media coverage of the war. This means that Canadian media quoted roughly one anti-war voice for every 158 military and government officials. So I'm sure you can imagine the consequences of this. Ottawa's carefully crafted position on the war dominated media accounts and influenced the public's perception of the conflict. And this connects to what I was saying about the book by Sean Maloney in the beginning. The attempts there that we saw to censor a history that contradicted D&D's narrative. What we have in this country is a state that is very keen on controlling the narrative around its military deployments. And we have a media system that helps them easily disseminate their propaganda amongst the public. And now we're just wrapping up, but before we move to Q&A, I wanted to emphasize something about the structure of the book, that each chapter of the book interrogates a different aspect of Canada's role in Afghanistan. The military, the economic, the media side, the deeper history, and infused through all of these chapters is a geopolitical analysis of Canadian foreign policy and Canadian imperialism since 1945. And the hope is that they all come together to illuminate the Canadian side of the war from many different angles, to present a well-rounded picture of the mission and its motivations, while challenging the mythologized history that so often dominates our national discourse. So ideally, the book would not only help readers come to a deeper understanding of Canada's role in Afghanistan, but also a deeper and more clear-eyed view of the Canadian military, the Canadian state, Canadian media, and the national myths that have proven so effective at limiting political discourse in this country. And I hope you buy a copy. We'll now go into the Q&A with Ethan Klein.
Are you going to be able to take questions on the screen?
Oh, sorry, I'll put that on in just a moment. Yes.
Good.
Sorry.
Let's watch.
Okay. Go ahead.
Sound check. Good. Thank you, Owen, so much for taking us on that journey in terms of your own trajectory about how this book came into existence, and then just a summary of your book's main points and the rest of the narrative. So thank you again. So I actually wanted to start at the end of your book for the beginning of our conversation Q&A. In your author's note, you mentioned how little written interrogation there has been in Canada's involvement in the war in Afghanistan, something you spoke to just a few minutes ago. And I was wondering if this lack of written material influenced how you went about writing the book. Maybe this made certain elements of research difficult or freed you up in other places, maybe influenced what to include, not to include, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. In terms of scholarship that's available on this topic, I was able to draw from memoirs of people who participated in the war at various levels, people in the Canadian military, the Canadian government, people involved in the Afghan state in various capacities. And there are also military histories that I was able to draw from and that were really useful. But I found with both the memoirs and the military histories that, well, they were able to interrogate certain elements of the war in really granular detail. They would often not ask questions about the geopolitical context so much. And that was something that we wanted to do with this book, that me and Jim Lorimer, the publisher, really thought was unique about what I was bringing to the table on this topic. As for the question about, like, did this free me up in certain areas? Did it restrict me in others? I mean, I think that the obvious negative is that you want more material to draw from. You want more research and analysis to incorporate into your own work to make it stronger. But on the positive side, knowing that there was that lack of more critical analysis. Actually, I should just name a few of the critical analyses that are out there that I drew from. Just before I forget, Empire's Ally is a great resource, edited by Jerome Klassen and Greg Albo. It's a collection of academic articles examining various aspects of really the history of Canadian foreign policy and how the war in Afghanistan fits into that history. And there's another, Creating a Failed State by John W. Warnock, Saskatchewan's own John W. Warnock, who's no longer with us. Those were two really good resources for me as I was writing. But on the question about, like, were there positive sides of this lack of scholarship, I think knowing that the perspective I was bringing wasn't really represented in the publications that were out there. I found that energizing in a way. And in my conversations with Jim Lorimer, we talked about this, how like so many of the people who put out scholarship on this topic are compromised in some way, or maybe that's too strong a word, but you know, if they were involved at certain levels, they might have their own experiences might inform what they write. It might create biases in certain ways. So yeah, I think we found that the perspective I brought, this kind of broader global geopolitical viewpoint or perspective on this war, we thought that was really unique. And so I'm glad that it's now out of the world.
I guess dovetailing off of that, then on the flip side, was there so you know, I found this book really tight, and it was a quick read, is very accessible, was not bogged down in really military speak or jargon, and you know, it was just smooth for me. You know, it came in at 170 pages. So I'm almost wondering, like, is there an 800-page doorstopper lying around for this, or like, was there a did you have was there a desire to write something longer, or was the length of the book and the tightness of the book very intentional?
Yeah, the brevity of the book was always my intention. I didn't think I had 800 pages of analysis to offer on this topic. But as for the accessibility of it, that was something that I came to through the editing process, through working with Jim Lorimer and the people at Lorimer Books. Because initially I had sent in a few chapters to Lorimer just on my own. And I said, hey, I think maybe you guys would be interested in this book. I think maybe it would fit well in your catalog. And they got back to me and they said, yeah, we like the perspective you're bringing, but this is it uses way too much specialized language. The tone is way too polemical. Like, we want to get this perspective out to as many people as we can. We want to broaden the potential audience as much as we can. So that led to kind of approaching more of an accessible language and tone in the book. And we came to that through multiple phases of editing. But as for that 800-page doorstopper, I mean, that does exist now, thanks to Sean Maloney and his work in Afghanistan. His book is actually in 3 volumes, and I added up the pages, and it comes to 1,800 pages. But again, good luck finding a physical copy because they're not printing it. But I clicked through the electronic version, and oh my God, what a wealth of information. It's so daunting. I mean, over 600 pages a volume, it's crazy. But now that's out there for people who are interested. I feel like I'll have to finish it at some point. I feel like I'm in too deep. I'm obligated to read it. But yeah, for people who don't have the time to read 1,800 pages, now there's the option of my book, I suppose.
Your book explores maybe more than any subject from my reading was the idea of the Canadian brand, or the idea that Canadians are humanitarian peacekeepers on the world stage. I guess sort of the first part of this question, there's a brief section on the Gray Lecture of 1947 that you introduce in the book, and why the Gray Lecture was foundational to this branding of Canada. Can you briefly talk more about the importance of that lecture, and maybe if there was anything you wanted to speak to that didn't make it into the book in terms of its significance?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was important for me to frame a lot of my historical analysis around the Gray Lecture, which was this lecture given in 1947 at the University of Toronto by Louis Saint Laurent, who at the time was the Secretary of External Affairs, and then he later became the Prime Minister. And the historical importance of this lecture that a lot of Canadian historians have identified is that it was one of the first moments where a Canadian official came out and he directly tied this idea of Canadian values to foreign policy, and said that Canadian foreign policy will reflect our national values. And he gave this speech just after World War II. So this was a time when Canadian national identity was really emergent and it was really beginning to form. So in this context of an emergent national identity, you had a major Canadian official coming out with this idea that Canadian foreign policy will reflect our supposed values of liberty and freedom and democracy. And so a lot of historians, myself included, we pinpoint this as an important moment when Canadian national identity was tied to foreign policy. And it still is today in the way that people discuss the Canadian brand, Canadian quote unquote humanitarianism. And as for the question about was there anything I wish I could have explored further about the Gray Lecture, there is a moment in that lecture when Louis Saint Laurent says that another thing that makes Canada unique amongst other mainly Western countries is that we don't involve ourselves in the affairs of other countries at all. We don't interfere in the affairs of sovereign states, which isn't true. I mean, I just finished writing a book with journalist Eve Engler about all of the coups that Canada has supported around the world since 1953. And we were able to document at least 20 military coups, mostly against elected governments around the world that Canada either actively or passively supported, from Guatemala, Honduras, Bolivia, Uganda, Iran. I mean, I could go on, Russia, there are so many. So yeah, I think the Gray Lecture, the enduring legacy of that, is a distortion of the reality of Canadian foreign policy. And I really hope that my book and the work of other historians will be able to chip away at that benevolent but false national brand.
Thank you. Let's have one more question for this round, and maybe do a Q&A and come back if there's time. So this is a little bit of a longer question, so your book really crystallized for me these elements of nation building Canada set out to achieve in Afghanistan. First, there was the hundreds of millions Canada funneled into various humanitarian democratic projects, building schools, running quote unquote free elections, establishing infrastructure for roads and potable water, etc. There are also millions going towards private sector development and investment, in total reaching upwards of $2 billion approximately. But we learned in order to do this, most of this money was put towards also industry consultants, private security, and quote unquote economic advising. These people were flown all over to speak at summits and conferences, were wined and dined and catered to with the promise their expert insight would eventually create systems and projects that trickled down to the people of Afghanistan. However, we come to see with your book that this is really not the case. The projects themselves are relatively hollow and wasteful, and they seem to exist in this sort of ecosystem where all these experts and consultants are basically being paid a whole lot of money to do really a whole lot of nothing. Can you speak more on the subject of waste in terms of nation building, and how you see this play out in other Canadian investments, either domestically or abroad?
Yeah, so just the last part of that question was, can I speak to how we see all of the factors that Ethan previously listed play out in Canadian engagement with Afghanistan and elsewhere around the world? And I think it's a great question. With Afghanistan specifically, I borrowed a lot from the work of Nipa Banerjee, who was the head of the Afghanistan arm of CEDA, the Canadian International Development Agency. So she was on the ground in Afghanistan at the highest levels, involved with all of these foreign aid and development projects. And she became extremely frustrated and extremely disillusioned with the entire process of Canadian aid over her years heading up the Afghanistan Department of CEDA. And a conclusion that she came to, that she wrote about, was that Canadian aid projects in Afghanistan were only about national prestige. They were about improving Canada's image in Afghanistan with the Afghan government, not the people, but with the government, and with other Western powers. And she writes about these conferences that you mentioned, where all of these advisors and experts and consultants and government officials would meet at the end of every year. They would toast each other, they would pat each other on the backs, and then basically celebrate the fact that they didn't reach any of their development goals the previous year. And in my book, for the deeper history of how Canada engages through the world, with the world through aid. I borrowed from the work of Keith Spicer, who worked in the Pierre Trudeau, and the Brian Mulroney governments in various positions. He wrote a book called A Samaritan State, ? And using his insider knowledge, does anyone here know the Colombo Plan, first of all, from 1950? That was Canada's first ever foreign aid project. People don't know about it, but it's really important to look at the motives behind the Colombo Plan to understand why Canadian foreign aid operates the way it does today. So Spicer writes about the Colombo Plan in 1950, which was this Western development coalition centered around the former British colonies in Asia. And it started in 1950, which is really important because the previous year was the Chinese Revolution, when Mao Zedong and the communists took over in Beijing, and they started this development process by which they really took control of their own national resources. And we can feel whatever way we want about how they ended up using it, but they did assert national control over their resource wealth. And that was something that terrified the Western imperial powers, including Canada. And Spicer writes in the book that the only motivation behind Canada getting involved with foreign aid was a fear that that would spread throughout Asia, that these other Asian powers would adopt development models by which they asserted control over their national resource wealth and blocked the ability of Western countries, Western corporations, from investing in these countries. So I think that deep historical view is so important in understanding the Afghanistan mission. And in getting at like what you were getting at with that question, the branding versus the reality, and yeah, the reality of how Canadian foreign policy functioned in Afghanistan and around the world throughout history.
Thank you. There any audience questions, whether in person or live, or in person or live on YouTube? Online, yeah.
Any, go ahead, Jeanette.
Oh, yeah, this is so interesting. Thank you both so much. Especially all the stuff about branding and optics and national narratives. I guess I just wonder a couple things, Owen. One, did in your research, maybe oral history interview type thing, did anybody refuse to talk to you? And the second one was just, what was the most challenging thing about writing your book?
I mean,
They're not related questions. They're just two things I was thinking of.
I guess I should repeat the questions. The first one was if I engaged with any oral history interviews, and if I did anyone refuse to talk to me? And the second one was, what was the biggest challenge of writing my book? And to the first question, I didn't really rely on oral history interviews. I mostly relied on written documentation, memoirs, military histories, applying that to my own theoretical understanding of Canadian foreign policy. So yeah, that didn't really come up in the process. Biggest challenge though, I mean, research is always a challenge. I would say the biggest challenge was having to read all these awful memoirs by Canadian people. I mean, those can be a slog. Some of those are like 800 pages. It's like, who do you think's reading this? I guess I read it. But yeah, that would be the biggest challenge, having to read a lot of insipid memoirs.
Thank you.
As follow-up, that was something else I did notice among kind of all the waste and all this money going towards these useless projects, was all this money that all these people were making to write these memoirs, or I can only imagine they were making money off of these publishing contracts.
I mean, that's a whole other question entirely. Like this publishing industry around the war, like after 2014, all these Canadian officials like Rick Hillier, Chris Alexander, Stephen Harper, John Chrétien, writing books about how great we did and how we accomplished all our goals and the Afghan people love us, and isn't it great that we were there? Like, don't ask questions about why we had to leave, or why a couple years later, or I guess several years later, the whole thing collapsed like a house of cards. Don't interrogate that, but just be thankful that we were there, be content in that knowledge, and give us money for our books.
Do you want a writing question or like a political question?
Surprise me.
Okay. Well, we'll do a political question sort of. So for say Canada's involved in another situation like Afghanistan, what can a Canadian citizen do to disseminate the information in a more helpful way to understand the conflict between when there's so much government propaganda on one side and then you have conspiracy theory fake news on the other? How can someone navigate that space and figure out kind of quote unquote what's really going on?
It's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of alternative media in Canada that I like a lot and that I generally trust. I mean, I write for Canadian Dimension, so I obviously like that one. Rabble will have some good resources for you. People's Voice can be pretty good. I mean, I rely a lot in terms of news on what's in the mainstream media too. But I just apply that to my own understanding of the world, to my own historical and theoretical foundations, and I just interpret that based on a moral code. Like, should we be involved in these wars? Should we be meddling in other countries? Should we be doing this or that? I think just getting an awareness of which voices you can and can't trust is really important, and then just interpreting these events based on that.
Do you think you need to be steeped in political history or theory in order to kind of use that compass when intaking and digesting and interpreting media sources, including more mainstream ones?
It helps a lot. I mean, I guess that gets at something else you said, Aaron, about like how to know what's conspiracy theory or fake news and what's reality. I think having a strong historical foundation will help you make that separation for sure. I think it's helped me a lot. It's helped people I know who are involved with organizing or alternative media to various degrees. So yeah, I think reading history is really important. Reading theory is important too. I don't think it's necessary, but I think, yeah, it is really helpful in helping you interpret the world.
Are we looking at white man's burden when we look at something like our intervention in Afghanistan? And how many times does it have to be repeated? We talk about the Boer War, and then we have, well, we had saturation bombing in my own country, Germany, in World War II, to try to get the people to turn against the regime. It did the exact opposite, kept them in power. We have Korea, we have Vietnam. I remember my own father saying the thing you said, and he was just a laborer, a carpenter. I was a kid, 15, 16, taking it in from Life magazine and so on. Look, what are the real reasons? He'd been on the Russian front, and we see it over and over again. War after war is actually lost in the end, but you're talking about millions of people being killed. And right now, there is an example going on in Palestine, which I think will be the shame of our age for a very long time. And once again, the Canadian government is very much involved. The Canadian media will give you the same line: a war on Hamas. The Hamas Air Force, the Hamas tanks, and everything else. What you have is people resisting. And this is something a friend of mine who I was with Saskatchewan Open Door for about 12 years, and it's a friend I knew throughout, who came as an immigrant, helping get his first job in a meat factory. He's now the head of the personnel manager there. A 300-person organization. It's got a couple of degrees. He came last night. I think he's watching online, but he had a plane load of people to welcome at the airport. So, time and time again, when you really talk to these people, why? I dealt with Iraqis. I dealt with Afghanis. Why are they there, and why do we hear nothing about what is really happening in the country, in CBC, in our news media? It's actually a script you hear time and time again, especially right now, talking about Palestine. You're talking about a war. You've got what, 30,000 dead now, many more to die of disease. At the same time as you still have a justification of a monstrosity. And we're talking now by now about 5 million dead, I think 3 million in Vietnam and so on. These interventions go on. And the net result is absolute devastation of the country. And yeah, there may be some terrorism because of what you put those people through. And yeah, Blowback by Chalmers Johnson. I don't know if you know the book, but it's very much about that. And we can only wonder what the blowback will be. The result will be to this genocide that's going on. Sorry, it's more of a comment than a question.
No, thank you for that. And I agree completely with what you say about how the genocide in Gaza, the genocide of Palestinians, will be the shame of this generation. And the Canadian government is not only indifferent, it's complicit in this. I mean, right now we have the de facto Yemeni government, the Ansar Allah, the so-called Houthis. They are disrupting commercial shipping in the Red Sea to try to pressure Israel to stop the genocide. The US and the UK bombed Yemen because of this, and Canada participated in that bombing. So we are actively involved in helping Israel commit a genocide in Palestine. But you look at the media coverage of this, there was just an article in The Breach media a couple weeks ago. It analyzed CBC coverage of Israelis versus Palestinians. And what this analysis found was that whenever Israeli violence is covered, the language is so muted when we're talking about genocide, when we're talking about massacres. I mean, we're coming up on 30,000 dead in Gaza. I mean, who knows how many more injured, disproportionately children, because Gaza has such a young population. And then when the CBC talks about violence committed by Palestinians, they use so many subjective words. It's brutal, it's vicious, it's evil.
Mm-hmm.
But they never use those words to describe the much, much worse violence of Israel. You don't see it. And I don't know where that situation is leading. I think about it almost constantly. Every day I'm thinking about how can this get better? And it is like a knife in my gut. I can't stop thinking about it. And Canada, the government that supposedly represents me, that supposedly represents us, the Canadian military is now involved in perpetuating this rather than stopping it. So I don't know, we'll be wearing this shame for the rest of our lives. And I can only hope that the public nature, the undeniable nature of this genocide, this horrific violence will snap some Canadians out of this delusional view that Canada supports peace and humanitarianism on the world stage. It doesn't. Right now it's supporting genocide in our names.
There's an online question. I hope I get it right. It says you mentioned that Canada or the media didn't get input or share the perspective of anti-government, anti-West. Can you elaborate on that? And the O2 Taliban was fully eliminated and emerged back in 2008. Oh, sorry about these mics. I think it's just going to keep going. I'm sorry.
Oh, there we go. So the question was about the marginalization of anti-war voices in Canada. What I mentioned in my presentation was a research by a professor named Brooks Cecilia analyzing Canadian media coverage of Afghanistan and which sources Canadian media relied on. And Cecilia found that anti-war voices would be quoted 158 times less than military and government officials. So that's what they're referring to. Did the question also ask about Canadian government as well as media?
It said Canada or the media.
Canada or the media. So yeah, I mean, that's what I would say to that question about the media. And the second half was about the Taliban, the resurgence of the Taliban.
Yes. Yeah. It says the Taliban in 2002 were eliminated and emerged back in 2008.
Right. So this is something that I've seen some military officials talk about how the Taliban was completely on the back foot in 2002. The government was overthrown, the forces were pushed back, and then by the time you get to 2008, though, they're very organized again, and they're really pushing back against the occupation forces. And I mean, the reasons for that have been identified by a lot of people. The new state that the occupation forces put in power was very unpopular. It empowered, warlords in the Northern Alliance who may have been anti-Taliban, but they certainly weren't pro-democracy. And just placing Canada in this history, there's a few really important operations in 2006. There was Operation Mountain Thrust and there was Operation Medusa in the south of Afghanistan. And Canada participated in Mountain Thrust, and Canada actually led NATO forces with Operation Medusa. And this was an important turning point because prior to this, a lot of the military engagements between the Taliban and the occupation forces were more conventional in character. But then Operation Mountain Thrust, and especially Medusa, were hailed as such a success at the time because they really destroyed the Taliban's capacity to fight conventional warfare. And that's where you see the turn to guerrilla warfare, to a more aggressive counterinsurgency. And you would think, well, some would think that that turn would signify that the Taliban were weakening. But they bided their time. I mean, they knew the landscape, they knew the people, they were able to reorganize, and by 2008, they were pushing back. And we know the end result of that. I mean, the US, Canada, all the rest, they didn't seem to learn from their errors. They didn't seem to understand that they were not popular in the country, that all of their actions were only making the Taliban more popular, strengthening their capacity to resist. And we know how that ended up. I mean, we all saw the spectacle of the fall of Kabul in August 2021. So I guess this connects to something that came up in my presentation or in the questions. I mean, these Western powers, they didn't learn. They didn't want to learn. But when they got kicked out, you see a lot of people blaming the Afghans themselves, or blaming the Pakistanis, blaming everybody but themselves. No introspection. And that's something that I want to fight against in this country. I want us to be introspective about that war, about our actions there, because otherwise we won't ever understand, one, why we lost, but also two, why we went there, and how Canadian foreign policy operates, period.
Did you have any more?
How are we for time?
You could probably ask another question if you got one. That's probably.
So you co-authored another book by with Engler. Am I getting the name right?
Eve Engler.
Eve Engler. That's due out in 2024. Can you tell us a bit more about that title?
Yeah, so that one's coming out next month already. Wow, with Baraka Books. The title of it is Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy. And Eve and I have been working on this for about a year. We were working on it, and the idea was to document every coup that Canada has supported since 1953. And I mentioned this in one of my previous answers. So we start with Colombia in 1953, the coup of General Rojas Pinilla, which was supported by the Pearson, not Pearson, Pearson was the foreign minister at the time. And Pearson said that Canada should support the coup because Rojas Pinilla wanted to buy Canadian fighter jets. So this would be a boon to the Canadian aviation industry. And then we go through Guatemala, Iran, all these different coups in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Asia. And we really wanted to document this seedy underbelly of Canadian foreign policy. And I think it's really important that people do get access to this information. I mean, it's the first book that we're aware of that actually documents Canadian-backed coups around the world. So I think it will be an important resource. It's written like this one in a very accessible way. The chapters seem to go by pretty quickly. There's a lot of information packed into each one though. So yeah, keep your eyes out for that one next month.
Thank you so much, Owen.
Oh, thank you.
And close things out if.
All right. I'd like to thank Owen and Ethan again for being with us tonight. We have copies of Canada and Afghanistan on the desks to your right and also here. And if you'd like your copy signed or if you'd like to say hello, Owen will be happy to meet you at the signing table there. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight and enjoy the rest of your evening.